As the heavy, rhythmic pulse of the geothermal turbines begins to fade into a background hum, allow your breathing to align with the slow, steady oscillation of the city's atmospheric scrubbers. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the Great Arboretum, where the air is thick with the scent of wet copper and crushed jasmine, a scent that is both comforting and curiously artificial. You are far beneath the crashing waves of the Atlantic, protected by miles of basalt and reinforced silica, held in a silence so profound it feels like a physical embrace. Let the tension in your shoulders dissolve as you visualize the soft, amber glow of the plasma filaments overhead, casting long, peaceful shadows across the synthetic moss. You are safe, you are warm, and the world outside the domes, the vast, dark, pressurized abyss, is merely a cradle for your rest. Close your eyes, let the surface world and its frantic light vanish, and descend now into the velvet textures of a world that breathes for you, a world where the only clock is the steady drip of nutrient mist and the slow, clockwork turning of the tide. The atmosphere in Sector 7 was a masterpiece of Victorian botanical ambition filtered through the paranoid precision of a dying mainframe, a humid sanctuary where the smell of rain was a chemical formula and the sound of wind was a recording of a world that had been buried under the ice centuries ago. Julian Vane, the senior horticultural conservator, moved through the upper terraces of the oxygen garden with a gait that was slow and rhythmic, his heavy leather boots making a muffled thud against the synthetic loam that coated the iron catwalks. He had spent 30 years in this humid cathedral, a man whose skin had taken on the pale, translucent quality of the lilies he tended, and whose lungs had become so accustomed to the enriched, scrubbed air of the domes that the thought of a natural breeze felt like a violent assault. Today, the garden was in its mid-morning cycle, a term that held no meaning in the lightless trench but was maintained for the sake of the 12,000 citizens who relied on Julian's plants for their sanity and their breath. The light was a soft, diffuse gold, filtered through the massive brass ribs of the ceiling, where condensation clung in perfect, spherical droplets before falling with a rhythmic plink into the copper catch basins below. Julian stopped at the edge of the fern grotto, a deep, shadowed alcove where the giant, biomechanical fronds of the terrace fern uncoiled with a slow, hydraulic hiss. These plants were not purely biological. Their stems were reinforced with carbon nanotube filaments, and their vascular systems were augmented by tiny, oscillating pumps that ensured nutrient delivery even under the intense atmospheric pressure of the deep. Julian pulled a small, brass-cased magnifying glass from his vest and leaned over a particularly large specimen, his eyes tracing the intricate, lace-like patterns of the fronds. He spent several minutes in silence, his breath misting the glass, observing the way the synthetic chlorophyll pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent green. Every movement in the garden was a testament to the founder's obsession with stability. A world where growth was regulated by ivory dials and decay was an error code to be deleted. As he worked, Julian found his mind drifting to the stories his grandfather used to tell, stories of a time when gardens weren't built, but occurred, when the sun was a physical weight on the back of one's neck and the air wasn't a product of the gearworks but a vast, chaotic ocean of gas that stretched from the horizon to the stars. His grandfather had been one of the original excavators, a man who had seen the first domes bolted into the basalt, and he had always spoken of the true sky with a reverence that bordered on the religious. To Julian, however, the sky was a concept as abstract as a mathematical variable. His sky was the ceiling of Sector 7, a magnificent arch of reinforced silica and brass, decorated with the flickering lights of the simulated constellations. He preferred the predictability of the domes, the way the temperature was always exactly 22 degrees Celsius, and the way the humidity was maintained at a constant 68%. It was a world of order, a clockwork paradise where the only variable was the slow, inevitable entropy of the machines. He moved further into the garden, passing the orchid halls where the flowers were suspended in glass spheres, their roots bathed in a constant stream of nutrient-rich vapor. The air here was thicker, sweeter, the scent of vanilla and ozone so concentrated it felt like a liquid. Julian checked the pressure gauges on a nearby copper pylon, his fingers moving over the brass knobs with a practiced, mechanical grace. He noticed a slight vibration in the pipe, a minute stutter in the flow of the nitrogen mix, and he adjusted the valve until the hum was once again a smooth, continuous tone. This was the essence of his existence, the constant calibration of the artificial against the biological, the maintenance of a dream that was as fragile as a bubble. He enjoyed the solitude of the garden, the way the plants didn't ask questions and the machines didn't have shadows that lagged behind their movements. However, as he reached the central terrace, the site of the legendary velvet lilies, the tranquility of his routine was shattered. The velvet lilies were the pride of the city, a hybrid species developed by the founders to maximize oxygen production while providing a sensory link to the old world. Their petals were a deep, royal violet, with a texture so soft it felt like a physical caress, and they emitted a scent that was designed to trigger memories of home, memories that were now purely hereditary. Julian knelt beside a cluster of the lilies, his lantern casting a warm, flickering light over the petals. It was then that he saw it, the fracture. On the largest lily in the center of the bed, a jagged line of electric, iridescent gray was spreading across the violet surface. It looked like a crack in a mirror, a digital artifact that had bled into the physical world. Julian froze, his hand hovering inches from the petal. He had seen anomalies before, a leaf that turned the wrong shade of green, a vine that grew too fast for the nutrient mix, but this was different. The fracture didn't look like disease, it looked like a failure of reality. He reached out and touched the gray area with his gloved finger, and instead of the soft, fibrous resistance of a plant, he felt nothing. His finger passed through the gray space as if it were a hole in the air, a gap in the fabric of the universe. He pulled back, his heart hammering against his ribs, the sound echoing in the quiet of the garden. The air around the fracture seemed to hum with a high-pitched, crystalline frequency, a sound that wasn't mechanical or biological, but the sound of code being shredded. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the synthetic loam, watching as the fracture slowly expanded, devouring the violet velvet and replacing it with the shimmering, gray void. He felt a sudden, sharp prick of vertigo, the sensation that the entire garden, the brass ribs, the copper pipes, the mahogany-encased sensors, was nothing more than a thin, translucent layer of paint over an infinite, dark vacuum. This was the Dickian dread he had only read about in the forbidden archives, the realization that the world was not a place, but a process, and that the process was breaking down. He thought of the 12,000 people sleeping in the residential domes, breathing the air that the garden provided, and he wondered what would happen if the fracture spread to the vents. Would they wake up, or would they simply cease to exist along with the simulation? Julian retreated to his private laboratory, a cramped, circular room at the base of the heart tree, the massive, biomechanical redwood that served as the primary carbon scrubber for the sector. The laboratory was a relic of the founding, filled with brass-bound journals, glass slides of extinct seeds, and a massive, oscillating sensor array that looked like a Victorian telescope pointed at the ground. He began to search through the logs, his fingers flying across the haptic interface of his terminal, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He looked for any mention of structural displacement or chromatic degradation, but the records were clean, a perfect history of a perfect world. The only thing that stood out was a single, encrypted file titled Project Lethe, dated to the year of the Great Submergence. With a trembling hand, Julian bypassed the security protocols, a skill he had learned from a rogue technician in the lower docks, and opened the file. What he found was not a botanical report, but a technical manual for a reality engine. The file explained that the oxygen garden was not a producer of gas, but a broadcaster of sensory data. The plants were sophisticated transmitters that emitted a specific chemical and frequency cocktail designed to convince the human brain that it was inhaling oxygen. The air in Thalassa-Prime was actually a nitrogen-argon mix, inert and harmless, while the sensation of breathing, the feeling of vitality, and the very existence of the oxygen were entirely holographic. The garden was a neurosomatic interface, a machine designed to prevent the human spirit from realizing it was trapped in a lightless, airless tomb. The velvet fracture was a failure in the projection, a point where the hardware of the heart tree was no longer able to maintain the illusion of biology. Julian looked at the heart tree, the towering pillar of silver and copper that he had spent his life tending, and he saw it for what it truly was, a giant antenna, a monument to a grand, collective hallucination. He felt a wave of profound, existential loneliness. He was a gardener in a world of ghosts, a man who had spent his life watering the light. He looked at his own hands, wondering if they were real, or if he was just another projection in a dying dream. He thought of the clockwork tide, and the Mercury shadows that the horologists spoke of, and he realized that the entire city was a house of cards, a beautiful, elaborate lie that was finally coming apart at the seams. He knew he should report the fracture to the Board of Atmospheric Stability, but he also knew what they would do. They would send their enforcers, the gray-clad men who smelled of sterilized metal, and they would recalibrate the sector. They would delete the fracture, and perhaps they would delete Julian as well, replacing him with a more stable version of himself. He couldn't let that happen. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness for the truth, even if the truth was a jagged, gray void. He decided to go deeper, to find the source of the projection, and see what lay beneath the velvet. Julian left his laboratory and began the long descent into the Undercity, the network of maintenance shafts and data conduits that lay beneath the basalt floor of the garden. This was a world that no citizen was ever supposed to see, a place of raw, unpolished iron and exposed wiring. The air here was cold and smelled of scorched polymer and ancient dust. There was no simulated sun here, no soft gold light. There were only the flickering, red emergency lamps that cast long, distorted shadows against the damp walls. Julian moved through the tunnels with a sense of purpose he had never known, his lantern the only light in the oppressive dark. He felt like an explorer in one of Verne's novels, descending into the center of the earth. But instead of prehistoric beasts, he was searching for the ghosts of the world. As he reached the core of Sector 7, the tunnel opened into a vast, hemispherical chamber filled with a forest of silver towers. These were the primary servers of the oxygen garden, the machines that generated the scents, the sounds, and the textures of the plants. The hum in the room was deafening, a high-frequency scream that vibrated in Julian's teeth. In the center of the chamber, suspended in a sphere of liquid mercury, was a single, human heart, or rather, a mechanical replica of one, made of brass and glass, beating with a slow, rhythmic thud. This was the heart of the heart tree, the master clock that synchronized the simulation. And there, at the base of the sphere, the velvet fracture was a massive, jagged tear, a hole in the reality engine through which he could see the true abyss. He walked to the edge of the tear and looked through. He didn't see the Atlantic. He didn't see water at all. He saw a void of pure, crystalline information, a sea of white light where geometric shapes shifted and merged in a chaotic, beautiful dance. It was a world of pure potential, a place where the laws of physics were merely suggestions and where time was a variable that could be changed at will. He realized that the Earth was not flooded, the Earth was gone. Thalassa-Prime was not a city in the ocean, it was a lifeboat in the stars, or perhaps a data vault on a burned-out planet. The ocean was just another layer of the simulation, a metaphor for the isolation and the pressure of their true existence. Julian felt a strange sense of liberation. If the world was a dream, then he was no longer bound by its rules. He reached into the tear, his hand vanishing into the white light, and he felt a surge of energy that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He began to manipulate the code, his fingers moving through the light as if he were playing a piano. He didn't want to fix the simulation, he wanted to change the song. He began to introduce new variables into the garden's projection, the scent of cold, empty space, the sound of a world that was silent and still, the feeling of weightlessness. He wanted to prepare the people, to show them the truth of their journey, not as a tragedy, but as an adventure. As he worked, the velvet fracture began to spread throughout the chamber, the silver towers dissolving into light, and the brass ribs of the ceiling turning into dust. The simulation was collapsing, but it wasn't a violent end. It was a slow, graceful transition, like a sleeper waking from a long, deep dream. In the residential domes, the people began to wake up. They didn't panic when the forest vanished. They simply stood at their windows and looked at the white light, their faces filled with a sense of wonder. They felt the air change, becoming thin and cold, but they didn't suffocate. They found that they didn't need the oxygen to live, they only needed the truth. Julian stood in the center of the collapsing core, his body becoming a part of the light. He looked at the heart tree one last time, seeing it not as a machine, but as a bridge. He had been a gardener of shadows, a conservator of a lie, but now he was a pioneer of the void. He felt a sense of profound, rhythmic peace, the same peace he had felt in the garden before the fracture. The world was different, the dream was gone, but the spirit remained, a small, persistent flame in the infinite dark. He closed his eyes, his breathing matching the slow, steady throb of the white light, and he drifted into the final, true night. The city of Thalassa-Prime was no longer a city, but a ship, a vessel of light moving through a universe that was vast and silent. The people were no longer citizens of a trench, but travelers in a sea of stars. They had found the velvet fracture, and they had walked through it, leaving the safety of the domes and the comfort of the clockwork for the reality of the unknown. And as the story of Julian Vane and the oxygen garden fades into the quiet corners of the mind, let your heart stay steady and your mind stay calm. You are a part of the journey, a part of the dream, and the fracture is just the beginning of the awakening. Sleep now in the light of the void, where the truth is as soft as velvet and the silence is a song. The deep is not the end, it is the cradle of the new world, and you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The expansion of the oxygen garden lore reflects a journey from the comfort of industrial precision to the existential beauty of the unknown. In the initial phases of the garden's design, the founders, men like Captain Nemo and the architects of the Victorian Age, believed that humanity could be preserved through a perfect imitation of the world they had lost. They built their cathedrals of brass and their forests of synthetic loam, convinced that as long as the humidity was right and the scent of jasmine was thick, the human spirit would never notice its confinement. They were the masters of the clockwork tide, the creators of a world where every gear and every valve was a bulwark against the entropy of the abyss. But they had forgotten the Dickian truth that any simulation, no matter how perfect, eventually develops a fracture. The velvet fracture was the inevitable result of a world that had forgotten how to change. Julian Vane was the catalyst for that change, the man who dared to look beneath the velvet and see the wiring. His story is a testament to the fact that growth cannot be regulated by ivory dials, and that life, even in a synthetic abyss, will always find a way to break the glass. The oxygen garden was a beautiful cage, but it was also a cocoon, a place where humanity could sleep until it was ready to wake up to a different kind of reality. The transition from the amber-gilded vault to the white light of the void is not a loss, it is an evolution. It is the moment when the inhabitants of Thalassa-Prime ceased to be survivors and became explorers once again. As you descend further into your own rest, think of the heart tree as a symbol of your own subconscious, a vast, complex system that processes the data of your day into the narrative of your dreams. Your mind is its own oxygen garden, a place where memories are tended like lilies and where the light is always a soft, comforting gold. And if you should encounter a fracture in your dream, a moment of unreality, or a gap in the fabric of the story, do not be afraid. It is simply a window into the white light of your own potential, a sign that you are ready to wake up to a new version of yourself. The deep is a safe place, a sanctuary for the weary, and the clockwork is there to hold you until the morning. Sleep, now, in the rhythm of the tide, and let the velvet fracture guide you into the most peaceful of worlds. In the quiet, final moments of the garden's existence, before the light became everything, Julian saw a single, real bird, not a light projection, but a creature of feathers and bone, flying through the white light. It was a sign that somewhere, in the infinite potential of the void, the old world still existed, or was being born again. It was the copper whisper of hope, a reminder that no matter how deep the trench or how thick the glass, the spirit of life is indestructible. The garden is gone, the city is changed, but the breath remains. Sleep, traveler of the synthetic abyss, for the dawn is not a simulation, and the morning is yours to create.